Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day. Welcome to our Big Book 12-step Zoom workshop. I invite you to really commit to an open mind and open heart. Each time, but maybe this is a special invitation given the topic of forgiveness today. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, the 12 steps in you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, the 12 steps, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Forgiveness is a very broad experience and process, and very deep. And it probably is something very much like a spiritual awakening, very parallel, I would use the vocabulary for, in terms of its progressive nature. If we're just in the personal attitude of wanting to be a decent human being, wanting to reduce our own suffering, just those two things. We want to reduce our own suffering. It totally self-centered motive. I'm very clear that nobody comes to a 12-step program because of altruism. That is the thought or action on behalf of somebody else. In fact, those people who do that come because of the courts or a partnership or an employer or a doctor. They normally don't make it if they stay motivated by outside circumstances. The people who make it, as Bill said, are the people who are willing, that's it, just willing, or tired of the suffering and open to stop resisting and to take direction and to take action. Really simple words and simple formula. I have a tendency to use lots of words and lots of big words and lots of complications in terms of my approach to almost everything. And it's much more effective in the transmission of knowledge and experience to be more simple. I'm convinced of that. It's hard to put words to a mystery. All the vocabulary that we bring to enter into the world of the spirit. We use poetry, we use complication, we use science. My first suspicion that forgiveness was even something that I wanted to consider began in the step work when I was 4 years sober. Before that, I had heard about it, of course. I studied to be a Catholic priest for 7 years. You learn a lot about the theory of and theology of, very little of the psychology, but a lot about the theology of and the history of in the Jewish Testament, the Bible of the time up to the birth of Jesus, and then the New Testament, the story about the unfolding of the New Testament, the Christian Bible. I'm not endorsing it, I'm explaining it. Forgiveness is permeated through literature and poetry and now psychology, of course, as we've become much more sophisticated in the last 100 years. But my very first glimpse of it in the true sense of an experience, not just the understanding and not just the reading of textbooks and the listening to self-help stuff, was when I began doing the fourth step. And quite frankly, the fourth column. That very first time I did the steps out of the big book when I was 4 years sober, I'm sure the man gave me instructions in column 3 that were maybe different and deeper than what I remember and what I remember doing. But it's irrelevant since I didn't do it and I don't remember it and I had no experience with column 3. But I remember profoundly having an experience with column 4, where I was taking responsibility for my behavior, 100%. It was embarrassing, it was profound, it was life-changing. A rite of passage really began there and to adulthood. And I didn't know it at the time, but it really rounded out and completed the process by the time I finished the 9th step. And again, I did not know that until I finished the 9th step. I was not aware of the process, nor the impact, nor the experience, mostly. Certainly not the organic whole and the total puzzle piece picture. But after I finished the amends process and had made amends to my dead father, that was probably the most significant representation of a forgiveness conclusion. I was, and even then I had no picture of the whole cloth, the whole painting. I had information in the 4th column. I had freedom that was developed through steps 5, 6, and 7. I had a whole new approach to steps 8 and 9 because this man was very specific and had lots of concrete experience of not just saying I'm sorry, but literally of attempting to balance the scale of justice. It's a great image. You cannot change the past, but you can correct it. And in every case, I have repaired the damage. Not to change the past and not to erase the memory of it, but to balance that scale with everybody that I was able to find, all of the people I was not able to find, and all dead people. Because of experience direction. And then I was asked, I don't remember exactly the circumstances, to be on a panel with some people to talk about forgiveness. And I was to come from the spiritual 12-step angle. Another person was to come from the psychological angle, and another person was to come from a particularly unique religious angle, a person who was trained in clergy. So there was me, the 12-step person, a clinical psychologist from Stanford who had no exposure to the 12-step program and had no tolerance for religion, and then this ordained person. And so in preparation, because I was intimidated by the subject, because I had never had any experience with it, But I wanted to do it, having an intuition that I had experienced something of profound connection to it through the 12-step process. I began reading. And the first thing I did was look it up in the dictionary. And if you get nothing from my sharing concerning this subject, but this one realization, this one appreciation, this one understanding, you will have made a huge pull back the curtain experience in forgiveness. I looked it up in the dictionary, which is what I recommend you do. And I have done that in the past. So many of you have done it. And different dictionaries describe it differently. But as I read the dictionary, and the most simple definition was a decision to release them, it formed in me as I was preparing my panel preparation, as well as in my meditation as to how to make it more effective, this image of this closed fist. Because this was me for 48 years, even 4 years sober, a closed fist in combat with life, in combat with people, in combat with my trying to get what I wanted to do and to beat open my path to having achieved what I wanted, to get what I wanted, wrestling happiness to the ground. That was really my modus operandi, even 4 years sober. And the dictionary simply said a decision to release them. And in my meditation, I just experienced that because I was reviewing my step 4 through step 9 process where I had identified the closed fist and that it was me 100% that had the closed fist for no apparent reason other than I was under the delusion that this was the way to get what I wanted. And the process of steps 5 through 9 are the process of literally having this beat out of me so that I was willing to, by the end of the 9th step, own that I had harmed people and owned my responsibility for addressing it in some creative, sometimes very spiritual way. 25% of the time, I never encountered the people. I never talked to the people. I never even addressed the people. But I addressed the harm that I had done to the people and or the institutions in some meaningful way, by my standards, checked out with a sponsor. As you know, that's my real suggestion for having a powerful experience with steps 8 and 9 is to make the list and to determine in prayer what the actions are and then review it with an experienced person so that you get a sounding board of objectivity, not permission and not necessarily any type of action in the sense of outside command, but basically using other people as a sounding board. And so we did this. And then this clinical psychologist had written a book. You've heard me talk about it endlessly because it is such a powerful presentation, the book, Forgive for Good by Fred Luskin, a PhD clinical psychologist, a professor at Stanford. I read his book and it paralleled the 12-step process. I mean, button down parallel, not the words. The words are all different because he talks psychology and I talk spirituality and 12-step. But underneath that, the dynamic that was driving the words was exactly parallel and the same. I didn't have words for the stages. He did because he's a scientist and he codified it. I had written a meditation on the process of forgiveness in preparation for this panel. And after we finished it and I had read his book and I became very enamored with him as a humble man, brilliant man, I reread the book and I incorporated the specific stages from a psychological standpoint into the meditation. And you have that in the Way of Life document. And that's what I'm going to review just a little bit in terms of the highlights. Because now that we've finished both the confirmation of all of the suggested instructions from the big book in steps 4 through 9, and most of you have, in fact, either finished the steps through 9 or at least sampled each of the steps through 9, you can really track this in terms of the path that we navigate, steps 4 through 9, that is the path of forgiveness. I don't think it's any accident that Bill Wilson uses the prayer of St. Francis in step 11 when he published the 12 and 12 in 1953. He didn't use it in the big book because he probably wasn't aware of it. In 1939, he had not met Father Ed Dowling, the priest who had read the first printing of the big book. The big book was printed 1939. Ed Dowling read that publication and met Bill Wilson in 1940 to discuss it because he intuitively said, this is an authentic spiritual manual textbook. And Bill and he were so connected as soulmates, if we can use today's terms, that Bill engaged him as his spiritual director for the next 20 years. Well, then Bill got very acquainted with the Catholic theology, the Catholic dogma, the Catholic prayers, and the prayer of St. Francis is clearly coming out of the Christian milieu and certainly adopted by the Catholic tradition. And so when Bill writes the 12 and 12 in 1953, he is coming then from his education, his exposure, and his experience from the Father Dowling exposure. And I can give you indications of that, as I have probably throughout our journey in each of the steps, where the commentary in the 12 and 12 clearly, many of the concepts comes out of the Catholic tradition. The point was, though, that the prayer of St. Francis has two allusions to forgiveness in it, as does the Lord's Prayer, which is not used in any of the big book or the 12 and 12. But the dynamic is, to the extent that we release them, we are released. So they intuitively knew the dynamic, not the words that Fred Luskin uses, not the words that the big book uses or the experience of the 12-step process. Our Father, written back in the 3rd or 4th century, codifying, allegedly at least, the words of Jesus. And the prayer of St. Francis, actually written in the 18th century, 19th century, not written by St. Francis at all, but codifying the spiritual substance of the St. Francis attitude and the spirit of St. Francis from, I think, the 12th or 13th century. So everybody's getting what the process of forgiveness is. Everybody's using different words based on the history and their culture. So taking a look then at the meditation, and if you haven't, I recommend it. And if you have, I recommend that you spend some time with it. It's when I write these kind of reflections, they're usually quite dense because I try to distill into the words maximum information, maximum knowledge, maximum power. And it takes a while to then unpack it. It takes me months to write something like this because I'm very, very picky with and precise about the use of words and the phraseology and the order of the words. So what is forgiveness? This meditation is 3 pages. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to refer to it and unpack the major stages of it and relate it to the step process that you've either been exposed to and or experienced. First of all, what is it not? Because there's a lot of misunderstanding about forgiveness, and that's why a lot of people resist it. No, you don't understand. What they did to me was criminal. It was tragic. It was life-changing. Yep. All of that is true. Absolutely. In many, many, many cases, deep post-traumatic stress syndrome, trauma, that changes your personality, changes even sometimes your biology, changes the absolute direction of your life forever and irredeemably. No question. Tragic, unfortunate, criminal, absolutely. So forgiveness is not to condone it. It's not to forget it even. And it's certainly not to reconcile unless you want to. It's not to excuse or minimize what was done by an institution or by people, family of origin, or complete strangers, or complete accidents, or somehow maybe in the whole universe, the impact of life itself on you. Tragic stuff. Can you even imagine, if you're not one of them, being raised in a country that has the kind of war or tribalism that just savages people over the last 100 years? And it certainly isn't to invite the hurt again where there's been abuse, or to surrender justice. I think I might have mentioned, I'm not sure, this series, a man I sponsor for several years and had taken through the steps, discovered that his father was in the process of molesting his two preteen daughters. And he had done this work after getting over the shock, the embarrassment, the hurt, the betrayal, and talking to it and praying about it. He was able to begin to release his dad and forgive his dad and want to have a relationship with his dad. At the same time, he reported him to the authorities and prosecuted him so that his dad at age 68 spent 6 years in federal penitentiary. Because although he forgave his father, he released his father, he sustained his relationship with his father. That was his decision. He wasn't going to model to his daughters that what grandpa did was all right. It was absolutely wrong, and grandpa was going to pay a huge price for that. I mean, that's dramatic. That's an example of forgiveness, but not giving up justice, not in retaliation. So forgiveness is a decision to not retaliate, to not exact revenge. Not about negativity. Literally, this is the image. That's why it's so powerful, a decision to release them. And as the St. Francis prayer and the Lord's Prayer says paradoxically, when I release them of the debt, I'm released of my debt. When I release them of the burden of their behavior, from my standpoint, I am released from the burden of the anger. It's paradoxical. What means is it's very spiritual, and we don't really know how that works, very much like the sayings in the program that we hear all the time. You can't give it away unless you have it. Well, that's logical. But you can't keep it unless you give it away. Whoops, what? And to the extent that you give it away, it grows in you. What? Whoops. But we know it's true. We know it experientially. Not one of us here hasn't had the experience of some aspect of what I'm just talking about. And even my approach to the spiritual awakening is in the same genre. Oh, we do a lot of work. Steps 1 through 9, only the most courageous and committed like yourselves do this work and stay with it. Not perfectly, not consistently, but somewhat diligently and awkwardly. And somehow we begin to finish somewhat and complete the step work. And we experience change. And when we look back over our shoulder, the change is far larger than the amount of energy we put into it. Disproportionate. That's why I say the spiritual math is 1 + 1 = 5. Because there's an X plus component in here from the Spirit. That's the words we use. Not scientific words, not mathematical or formula words, not certainly concrete words, nothing that we could justify or certify. And other people might not even believe us, and it doesn't matter because we know the truth. It's our experience. I cannot get here from there, and yet here I am. I can't explain it, I can observe it. Ellie was talking before we started about the freedom. Mind-boggling, dazzling. I wake up every morning and I go, really? Almost like that. Really? And it's been like that for over 30 years. 32. Notice I'm sober 37 years. The first 5 years were a challenge. I didn't know how much of a challenge. And by my standards at that time, it wasn't much of a challenge because I was anesthetized. And as I thawed out in the rooms in those first 4 years and then did the steps out of the book, that 5th year, and then had my spiritual awakening, I began to be more conscious of my journey, my feelings, my thoughts, the impact of me in my community and in my environment. So the first stage that Dr. Luskin talks about is to name it. That's why I talk about it beginning with the 4th step. We begin naming our resentments. We name our fears. We name our dishonesty. Dr. Berger, one of my associates as a clinical psychologist, we co-facilitate various things, especially on emotional sobriety. He has a phrase in his psychological practice: to name it is to tame it. See, that you can remember stuff like that, especially since that's your experience. When you name it, meaning you list your resentments, you write about it, you analyze it, and then you talk about it, somehow the power of it goes away. And especially in the 3rd column, when we get there in the big book, and Bill gives us a prayer practice because he says we're powerless over our deep resentments as we are over our addiction. And we have a prayer to release ourselves. We're not praying for the other people who abused us or for whom we have a resentment. We're not praying for them. We're not praying for the institutions. We're praying for ourselves, for the divine spirit, the divine surgeon to enter into our souls, into our hearts, into our cellular structure and heal us, releasing us. We're praying that we receive forgiveness, not in the sense of go forth no more and sin no more. No. That's the old confession and the traditional Catholic. I'm not demeaning it. I'm just explaining the robotic nature of it. I never got released practically from going to confession and getting absolution. The purpose of it was that, but it required a lot more intention and consciousness on my part, which I got then through this 4th step process, especially the consciousness of the prayer practice in the 3rd column. And I've mentioned it many times before, but in the context of this, it's worth reminding you that I did the steps the first time, only having an experience with column 4. The second time, 3 years later, I had an experience with column 3 and the prayer for the removal of deep resentment. And the benefit of that was at the end of the first journey in the steps, with the full spiritual awakening of the 4th column, the next time I did the steps, I had all 85 of those resentments still present and all 8 of the deep resentments still present 3 years later. They were not removed. But when I had the opportunity to experience the 3rd column that's extended as we do, an interpretation from the Big Book, and the prayer for the removal of deep resentment, the next time I did the steps 3 years later, not one of those resentments was there, not even a hint of mint, not even a spark of fire connected to any of those 85 general or the 8 specific deep resentments. I mean, that's startling. You talk about being released. I'm just sharing my experience. I'm not setting up an expectation for yourselves. Everybody's journey is different. And so the first piece of the stage of forgiveness is to name it, to analyze it. All right. And so that's the second stage, to understand it. That's why I use the word analysis of column 3, analysis of column 4, and we do a deep dive. I speculate, because it's my words to capture my experience, that I actually penetrated the unconscious. Bill might shudder at those terms, but he doesn't certainly even imply that in the Big Book, but it's absolutely my experience. A much more profound understanding and experience of my movements of my psyche than I ever had in the depth psychology that I participated in therapeutically for years and in different circumstances. That third phase then is to identify the rules. I got to do that in the 3rd column. The unenforceable rules, that's a term from Fred Luskin, not from the Big Book. But it certainly identified what our experience is and my vocabulary about it, which is that we look at our beliefs, most of which are delusional. I should, you should, they should, the world should, and the word should reveals our delusional beliefs, or at least opens the curtain a little bit for their examination. Identify what the rules are. Unenforceable, because I write a script about how things should be, and when they're not, I get angry. How foolhardy is that? I mean, that's insanity. Thinking that I determine what reality is, when in fact, my role is to respond to what reality is, not to determine what it is, but to find out what it is and to adjust to it. Reality never adjusts to us. That's that 4th column. What's real? The 5 questions Bill gives us is all about the fact that we've written a script that comes from our self-centeredness. It determines our fear, it determines our anger, it determines our attitude, it determines our behavior. It's a survival instinct. I'm not, how do you say, judging it and whipping it. No, not one bit. I'm observing it and saying, well, this is how we operate. And when we're unconscious, we operate from instincts gone awry, Bill says. When unconscious, we operate from emotions that dominate us, that disturb us, as Bill says in the 12 and 12. And our role really is to manage our emotions and to manage our instincts with our consciousness. That's truly human. That we transcend our instincts from the body. We transcend our emotions from the limbic system. And we manage all of this with our executive functioning from our cortex, that final development of the brain that allows us to be human, that in fact is the constituent two ingredients that make us human. I have a mind that thinks and a will that decides. And I accept full responsibility for it. Oh my God. It's my life, and I have exactly the life that I have earned. I'm saying it that way. I hope you're shuddering. I hope you're resisting. Maybe some of you who have had the experience are going, yeah, unfortunately, so true. I have exactly the life that I've created. With my hammer, with my chisel, I have exactly the life that I created. By my response to people and institutions and reality. My response is what creates my life. The good news is when I accept that responsibility, I can make different responses by becoming more conscious and changing my attitude and changing my actions. See, we do have free will. It's just not free with regard to our addiction, the next stage here in the forgiveness process. Accepting that full responsibility then, and it's about my thinking, consciousness, and it's about my decisions and the actions I take. The actions tell me everything. I've said it so many times. The real litmus test, if you really want to do an inventory and know immediately, look in the mirror of your feet. My feet tell me who I am. My feet tell me what I believe. My feet tell me what principles I've adopted. And makes me conscious of it if I look at my behavior, my feet, my behavior. My feet cut me no slack. My feet tell me confrontationally the truth, if I'm willing to observe and interpret it. But even there, we cut ourselves some slack, and we need accountability partners. That's why sponsorship, I believe, is the critical ingredient in all the moving parts of the program. This is actually a wonderful summary for us who are concluding this step process. The step process of certainly 4 as an inventory, 5, 6, and 7 as cleaning out the junk in ourselves that is the impediment to my relationship with our true self, with the spirit that is deep inside of me. Those are probably not two different realities in the sense of our observation. They're probably essentially or existentially different. I'm not saying that we're God. I'm not saying that we're spirit with a capital S. But spirit is deep down inside of me. And that's what gives the life force to my life force, my spirit with a small s. Flip sides of the same coin, or the wave in the ocean, as I used that metaphor in step 2. Underneath each of the steps is powerlessness. I've made that comment before, and it really helps me apply to each step then prayer. And so we go into steps 8 and 9 to rehabilitate our relationship with others in prayer, certainly the set aside prayer, whatever other prayer that you want to make up for bringing to your own consciousness the willingness to change. That's amend, that I'm willing to change my behavior. Oh, I can't on my own. Well, listen to the step 11 step itself, the words. Praying for the knowledge of God's will and praying for the power to do it. See, I can have the knowledge, but the unmanageability, the spiritual malady, unfortunately, doesn't allow me to do it because of my self-centeredness sometimes. So I need to pray for the power also. Underneath steps 8 and 9 is our powerless to be willing and are powerless to make a change, and are powerless to, in fact, want to or even to do the repair that is indicated. And so we pray and we hold ourselves accountable and we take the next indicated action. There's the simplicity again. And I'm going to boil it down to the simple term. Life is taking the next indicated action. I could complicate it a little bit by saying life is taking the next indicated action based on principle. That's the counsel I give to all of the men that I work with. Identify the operating principle and always take the high road. Be generous with life. Be generous with reality. It never fails. I cannot out-generous reality. I cannot out-generous life. I cannot out-generous God, to speak in the terms that we like to speak in. At the end of the meditation on page 40 in the Way of Life document, I have a prayer for healing. That's my observation of the process, the outcome of the process, especially steps 8 and 9. The words from the people that I met and talked to were, "This has been so healing." Not words that I brought to them, but because of the process I brought to them, the experience that they reflected back to me. This has been so healing. You know, and when they say that, I'm healed. It didn't change a thing in terms of the history. It didn't change a thing, but it changed everything at that moment in terms of my memory, in terms of my attitude, and that impacts my behavior. Forgiveness is freedom. I wrote the meditation 30 years ago. I revised it probably 20 years ago to coordinate with Fred Luskin's stages of forgiveness from a psychological standpoint. I was in meditation about it 5 years ago. And this thought came to me in meditation. A forgiving person has no past. Freedom. A forgiving person has no past because they've released it. A forgiving person has no past, but an unforgiving person has no future. It's powerful. It was startling to me. It came just boom, bubbled up, and I wrote it down. And what I mean by that is we're shackled to the disruptive and negative attitudes and emotions of the past to the extent that we hold on to them, and we're given freedom to live a life of openness and healing when we make a decision to release that. Not a decision that is an event, but a decision that is the beginning of a process. And I hope in this discussion I got through to you that this wasn't an event that happened in 1988 because I went through the steps once. It was a process and an experience that manifested over 6 to 10 years as I did the steps multiple times with multiple peoples, with multiple efforts and multiple changes in my consciousness. And it's only when down the road we stop for just a minute and we look back over our shoulder at where we've been that we can see the entire tapestry. So let's close for the day. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things that cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.